glad to have the panel here in front of me so that I can speak less and they can speak more. I get to ask some questions, and I'll pass the microphone to you. To start, I want to thank Legat Architects for gathering all of these leaders from around the Midwest to come here to Chicago, and for DIRT for generously sharing their space so we can discuss these pressing civic policy and design issues with you, local designers and architects. The American 2050 plan describes the Great Lakes megaregion as spanning from Minneapolis up to Pittsburgh and from St. Louis all the way to Toronto. It contains major metropolitan areas including the Quad Cities, Indianapolis, Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, which is the major hub linking all these cities together. This region contains over 20% of the world's freshwater, 84% of the surface freshwater of the United States, and it also represents the fourth largest economy in the world. So our discussion this afternoon will center on urbanism and the role that urbanism can play, both in climate protection and economic inclusion. Specifically for Chicago, we're looking for ways to reframe the discussion around making design and climate revitalization work for people, for the actual human beings who live, work, love, play in our cities. This includes low-income and underprivileged residents, refugees, and immigrants. So we have four panelists with us today whose work concentrates on examining these themes within the context of the Great Lakes megaregion, with a special focus for some of you on Chicago. I'm going to keep the introductions fairly brief because several of them have already been in front of you, and we have another to look forward to our keynote tonight. So starting at the far end, Maria Arquero de Alarcon is an associate professor of architecture and urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan. She also has her own studio, Made Studio, a research-based collaborative design practice. Kerl LaJeune is the Deputy Director of Planning and Design at the Public Building Commission of Chicago. He oversees new and renovated projects as the Design and Construction Director of Public Facilities and Infrastructure on behalf of the City of Chicago, Cook County, and various sister agencies. Dr. Joseph Schwieterman is a professor in the School of Public Service, Department of Public Policy, and Sustainable Urban Development Programs at DePaul University. And then finally, Thomas Fisher is a professor in the School of Architecture, the Dayton Hudson Chair in Urban Design, and the Director of the Minnesota Design Center at the College of Design, University of Minnesota. Did I get all of that right? I have the right people? Okay, good, we're all here. So the first question, I live on the northwest side of Chicago in Portage Park, in a nice little Chicago bungalow. And if you were to sidle past my house on almost any evening and eavesdrop on a typical conversation with my 3-year-old, you might hear some challenging questions about household policies, such as, why can't I play with that knife? And I don't want to let go of Dada's hair. And these, for my son, are not rhetorical questions. He actually doesn't stop until you sit down and actually have a conversation about why he can't do these things. And for my wife and I, figuring out how to answer these and explaining why we enforce these policies, we're finding they mostly relate to our household values, namely, be safe, be respectful, and be kind. So, in this time of extreme political ideology and dogma, some as bad as any 3-year-old, what are the common values of the megaregion, if any? And then, how can we effectively plan a region across political boundaries? So I'll pass the microphone to whoever wants to start.
Maybe someone in the audience.
Well, maybe I'll start. So one of the things we do at my center is we actually have been doing quite a lot of system and service design in the political realm. So I've been giving a lot of talks to political science groups, which is an interesting phenomenon because, you know, unlike this room, the left wing will sit on one side of the room and the right wing sits on the other. They hardly talk to each other. And you know, so I begin by saying, you know, ideology kills innovation. because you think you know the answer before you've asked the question, right? And so our political realm has become so ideological that it's unable to innovate anymore. Because, to build on your point about your kids, the most important question to ask in any process is why. Like, why do you do that? And so a lot of the design thinking work that we do is to go into rooms. We also do a lot of work in the healthcare system where we say, so why do you do that? And then why do you do that? And what you find out is that frequently they don't know. It's just sort of what they've always done. And that's the opening to innovation. That's the moment when you say, okay, let's reframe something, let's look at it differently. And we desperately need that in our politics because nobody is asking these kind of fundamental questions. And actually nobody, I would argue, and as I argue with in these political gatherings, is that actually they almost all agree in the ends. They just disagree on the means. I mean, nobody's going to say we don't want people who are employed. We don't want people who are safe. I mean, they all agree on those things. They just argue fiercely about small minutia based on some ideology. So anyway, I actually am a believer that design is a leadership skill that is desperately needed in the world, that designers need to engage more broadly than just the built environment, but to see that in fact we have a way of reframing issues, asking kinds of questions that a lot of others in other spheres are not asking. Okay, start with that.
Thank you.
It's a tough one to follow. I'm a flyer. Do you have that question in advance or something? Well, I'll just give it more from the geographic sense that I look at what, maybe not as far out as Toronto, but you look at Detroit and Cincinnati and how Chicago, as economic patterns evolve, the gap between rural living and urban living is probably getting wider in the sense that what millennials want, what young people seek, isn't what small towns offer. Often something like 70% of Illinois County is going to lose population in the next 10 years. And Chicago, for all its problems, we're losing people in the city as a whole. We have a crime problem, we have an image problem, we have a building boom downtown, and we have lots of hiring downtown. Other cities are doing the same thing. And attracting and maintaining talent, even if you're in Detroit or Cincinnati or St. Louis or Springfield, you have to have a connection to that global city that makes people feel part of something bigger, more cosmopolitan, more happening, more creative, as you point out. And so these interconnections are really important, even for small towns, to be connected to that. I wish it meant our global city was growing fast. We're not. But the core why we're ranked in the top 15 in the world are still there.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I think the issue of asking why is something that doesn't happen enough. On the public realm, and what I deal with all of the policies and mandates that come, and the work that we do at the PBC, we get our mandates from the mayor, and then it trickles down through the agencies. And because it's public, the automatic assumption is it's supposed to be dumb and simple and not innovative, when in fact, my goal is to try and push the question of why every time. Why are you doing it this way? Why are you just accepting the rules and the guidelines as something that we know for sure is probably 10 years old and it hasn't changed in a while? So the neighborhood question of how to impact policy and how to impact the public good should always be a why question.
I'm also going to talk a little bit from the role that I see institutions, academic institutions, higher education playing, and through the lens of planning and design. It's a lot about whys, about how we are helping our students to interrogate the legacies that they are receiving, and also how we can help them to, through the tools and techniques that we have as designers and urbanists, to make sure that we are representing a wider constituency. Designers don't normally reach many areas of the city, and for someone coming from Europe to a city like Ann Arbor, very close to Detroit, I'm also working in Latin America. One of the things that obsesses me the most is how we need to reinvent ourselves and our professions to truly be advocates of many of the citizens that don't have a voice, don't have the resources. And I think sometimes in the profession it's difficult to find the time and the resources to do that. And I think in school we have almost like a mandate to have that critical eye so that we can truly fabricate together a better future that uses design to help us see differently. So that's, I think, it's a lot about the why, a lot about reinventing ourselves and how we are answering the questions so that they are not pro forma, they are trying to challenge a little bit how we have it.
Excellent question, answers. When you start to talk about citizens that don't have a voice, how do we begin to reframe some of the things we do in the city or in the region to respond to those citizens? So maybe the question formally, is it possible to reframe local, national, immigrant identities through the lens of urban citizenship? So instead of belonging to the left wing or the right wing or from Europe or from New York, instead we belong to this urban region. And can the city reinvent the institutions of the city to serve a more inclusive and diverse definition of citizen?
So let me give you an example. So we were asked by our city of Minneapolis to deal with a problem of people experiencing homelessness sleeping on the trains, right? And they said, you know, how can we get those people off the trains? And we flipped it completely around. We said, wait a minute, we actually spent a lot of time riding the trains with people experiencing homelessness, understood their lives, found out that many of them are working, but that the shelters close at 7 p.m. Many of them, their jobs aren't over until after 7 p.m., so they literally have no place to sleep except the trains. So what we did is we flipped it around. We said, look, you know, there's such a thing as sleeping cars on Amtrak, for example. So we had proposed that they have sleeping cars as part of the train system to allow people who have no place else to sleep. And we've shown them how, and we've actually proposed on the platforms that there be offices for social workers, that there be an office built in to the train for social work, and so that you basically, instead of trying to resist what people do naturally, is try to understand why they're doing it, and then try to design with that in mind. And so we'll see. This was a big shock, you know, they weren't expecting it. This is why it helps being an academic, because they can be really angry at us, and it's like, well, whatever, I got tenure, you know. So, but sometimes I think it's true for all of us. We have to speak truth to power. We have to be willing to sort of say things that we think they should at least consider. So that's an example.
Now, I'll take that in a different direction. I think with digital technology, it is remarkable how people are connected now in ways we couldn't imagine 10 years ago, with broader networks of people that you stay in touch with, geographic location of your friends. My kids show me the latest app. I'm just astounded. Just, you know, so-and-so's in Barcelona today. Just, and with Google now, you can actually, you know, track where you've been over the course of the day. The app turned on, it can now predict what mode you were. So people really are connected, and that's kind of an urban phenomenon, where people live all over the city, but they know where each other are at. And I think that's added to city life in terms of the ability to have networks. Now that said, face-to-face often suffers. It's not the same as having a digital connection as actually talking to someone, so impression is up and all kinds of things. But at its core, it's make urban living very exciting for people. I think the problem is those networks are really, people interact with people like themselves. So we're a block away from the millennial capital of central U.S., the merchandise mart, where, you know, good example where you have a gigantic network of people, and probably the networks are mostly fellow millennials because of the nature of their work. And how few reasons people have to go to the South Side. Probably I'm sure Chicago has never even experienced much of the South Side. And so the networks are very exclusive, and that doesn't serve to integrate us in the same way. And in Chicago, we're still looking for solutions to cause socioeconomic mixing more that will create more dynamism between the rich, poor, and middle class. And I don't think we have the solution for that yet, but I think we now, we're seeing city policy really focus on addressing some of these dysfunction on the south side and the west side of emptied out neighborhoods. And I'm optimistic that this polarization will increase some.
I would redefine the engagement age of citizen. I think it should be much younger. At the level of participation now, everyone in this room is too old. And you look at the impact of the 13 and the 14 and the 15-year-olds right now, and it kind of says to you, this is really about the future for them, where we're so jaded, we have so many things in our minds, that while we think we're planning for the future, we're just worrying about right now. So take it down a few years.
Yeah, I was thinking of something different, that I'm really interested in this conversation about the digital and how much the digital is going to empower us to go over the digital divide that exists today, instead of making our cities even more divided and more, polarized. I'm not so sure that, the way in which we have access to data is empowering for us to make better cities. What I see is that for sure real estate developers know how to deal with market segmentation, and they are planning the cities and every Starbucks knowing exactly who lives around. I don't know if the average citizen is able to access data that is critical and to be able to consume that data to make the right decisions. And I think, one of the ways in which, when I wonder about what are the institutions of the future, I very much wonder about what are the places where we need to educate ourselves on, how we are using digital tools, how we are enabling our data and others' data to be collectively used with more intelligence. And I don't know if there are the institutions of the future, but I think we need to reinvent what the schools need to be now, what the cultural centers of the libraries, or what are those moments in which we can come together to empower ourselves with much of this data and many of these resources. And this is critical because now we are rethinking on how to completely change our curriculums and the way in which we deploy the classes and how we engage students that we will never see in person online through these massive courses. All this, I think, is it's an opportunity to truly change how we think and how we do things, but it's also an incredibly empowering tool if it's not used correctly. So I'm really curious to hear you saying that Chicago is starting to think on how to deploy that kind of intelligence better. I don't know if we are yet there in Detroit, but yeah, collectively, I'm really interested in some of these issues. The second is just thinking on the tremendous power that cities have to resist and to embrace, I think, more progressive agendas. And we are seeing that in the States. I think it's one of those moments in which I feel incredibly, optimistic about what is possible when I see cities, more broadly investing in embracing immigrants and refugees and, trying to make everybody feel home. And I know there are a lot of problems, but when some of these, incredibly powerful entities that cities are coming together to galvanize themselves against, the many discriminations that, are happening now coming from the federal level, I see a lot of hope. And sure, I'm politically motivated in my statement, but I see cities holding a lot of power to truly reinvent urbanity in the next few years. So why not?
Thanks for that reminder. As a city dweller, I forget, I think, sometimes the power of the community I live in. And did anyone, I think Lauren, you went, there was a rally of young people for climate change that happened, not just, but it's in Daily Plaza, right? Federal Plaza, and hundreds of students, high school students, and across the nation. And seeing that is a really powerful thing, both about the wrong age group who we're addressing, but also the power of our city. Thank you for those comments. Should there be a greater cooperation at the inter-municipal level in order to meet the challenge of climate change? So specifically in the development of projects with multiple municipal stakeholders.
One thing you might try, what we do in the Twin Cities is that every month all the mayors in the region have lunch. And ULI funds it, and it is an incredible thing. I mean, we all just go because you know anybody interested in urban issues is invited, and we sort of sit. We're like the peons. We sit around the edge, but I mean, it does so much to get communities working together around questions, and then they always have speakers who will put out often issues around social justice or climate change, and get all the mayors to think about possible policies. In fact, we'll go there and we'll pitch policies to them that they start taking back and enacting. And so I think part of it is just getting people in the room and looking at each other face to face and having conversations, because they're all struggling with the same kinds of things. And I think they're actually looking to communities like ours for creative ideas. So anyway, that's just one thing that you might try.
I'll say a couple things. First, when I first moved to Chicago in the early 80s, suburb, when you say where you're from, you would say Chicago, Des Plaines, Naperville. Now people in Naperville, you meet somebody in another state and say, I'm from Chicago. Actually, outside Chicago. The suburbs identify with Chicago and see that as kind of their reason for existence or their broader identity in ways that we don't have that city-suburban tension that we used to have. Just terrible. I mean, transit funding, everything was about it, creating the RTA, the suburbs, 90% no, the city, 90% yes. We had one more voter than they did, so it was created. So that's been a really good thing. There isn't this antagonism. And I think Mayor Daley, Richard J. M. Daley, deserves a lot of credit for bringing our mayor's caucus. And then that kind of, I think the steam on that diminished a little bit when we started attracting all these corporate headquarters from the suburbs, which is a great thing for downtown, but it sort of led a little more to this distrust about, is the city looking out for us or not. But most of the things are much better. Our regional planning agency, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, seems to be doing a remarkable job on salesmanship and using the small stick they have to force, or entice, I should say, suburban governments to play ball on bigger regional planning issues, which has been really great. There's now support for congestion pricing and for affordable housing and things that 5-10 years ago were probably off the table. We're having an event in December, and I've been asking people, what is it about climate change that gets suburban residents interested in playing ball with these climate change problems we have? And preserving fuels kind of lost its luster as fuel prices fall and fracking and all, but one thing now is we have severe flooding all around the suburbs because of the rising extreme weather. And every suburb is facing this problem of how to grapple with floods. In our region, it's a terrible problem. Probably not so much in lakes over. So we're finding that city governments now using that as our hook. We need a new building code. We need more open space preservation. We need no watershed planning. We need to save the river from overdevelopment so it can overflow. And we're seeing some pretty big movements in the suburbs to change the way developers build with more attention to the sustainable features of using water as that hook, which is, you look at Lake Michigan now, it's like almost over flood stage. So we may face that in the city if we have some rainstorms and we can't open the locks to empty the water because the lakes are in the river. It's going to really elevate this issue. It'll be a surprising new development because 10 years ago it was all about carbon emissions and fuel savings, and now it's extreme weather that we're in, so we have.
Yeah, the flooding is pretty interesting in Chicago when you look at it. There's a close relationship between sort of the policy and architectural management. The agencies, of course, are trying to figure out how to manage engagement with multiple stakeholders. The many sort of agencies that we serve, the ones that we all know of, Chicago Public Schools, Fire, Police, Park District, and so on across the city, there are always multiple stakeholders. And what I found is we're always afraid to ask the question because we don't want to hear what the answer will be for us to have to deal with it. The agency deals with it, the policymakers deal with it. So it's really about change and trying to get to everyone that change is good and that it doesn't have to be negative does require a level of interaction. You have to be really ready for that change to kind of tackle it. And that engagement, whether it's one individual, a full community, or just the stakeholders of the project, just requires all of us to change a little bit.
I think you have touched on interesting things already. I think for climate change to truly be tackled, just we need collaboration at many different levels. Work that we have been doing in Detroit, but also in the western side of the state, looking at how climate change is going to impact on the small municipalities that have actually very little capacity by themselves to truly adapt. It's really very telling. There is something that was really shocking. We could not even talk about climate change to start with in the meetings because for many residents that was the way of getting started with a conversation. They, oh yeah, now you're going to tell me how I need to build my property, right? So there is, something about that immediacy of I don't want to deal with anyone telling me what I should do. And then I think what is also a lack of embodiment of what are some of the issues that we are discussing. In many of these small municipalities, what we saw is that our memory is really short, and we were collecting information and maps and data and photographies of previous flooding, pretty severe flooding, and we were finding over and over that residents were challenging our evidence, saying that flooding had never hit those areas. When we were even pointing out that homes that had to be demolished in the waterfront just because of rising levels of the Michigan Lake, we saw some of them scratching, and even with the photos, with the historical area photographies, so they could actually see. It was a tough conversation. So I think we live in a region that is so incredibly resourceful and generous, and we don't feel subjected to major crisis. We have flooding every now and then, but this flooding is not even that the lakes is raising water. It's actually flooding coming from our own dysfunctional infrastructure systems. So I think there is something about building an imagination that that connects us better to other parts of the world, so that we can better understand what are our individual responsibilities. But it's incredibly challenging. We have seen how to talk about many of these issues and what it may take to start changing attitudes and behaviors. Not only in how we build our homes, but actually in how we question our own collective responsibility in changing the environment. So that is, at the level of every citizen taking on things on a kind of personal set of choices. But then what we see is that it was very, very difficult to persuade more than one municipality at a time, part of the research project. So in only 2 instances, we were able to work together with the city and the township, meaning how are you going to be dealing with issues of changing levels in the lake or changing climate patterns if you need to constrain yourself to the administrative boundaries that we are inheriting. And there was not that much
actually engage in a larger conversation than the municipality at a time, because that was the most municipal planners could imagine themselves actually operating. So only in 2 instances we had a larger area of study than the city per se, to deal with something that is global, but we are still trying to work on it at the local level so that we can start taking action and changing attitudes. So incredibly challenging. It's not only in larger cities maybe there is more of an understanding, a desire to start a conversation, but then in cities what we see is an incredible fragmentation of on one side you have buildings and then public works and then parks, and all these things are actually related. But then what do you need? Another transversal department that looks at how we are actually dealing with integration of all these systems, and then we are even adding more bureaucracy to what is already a pretty fragmented governance. So these are all incredible questions that I think we have something to do as designers, but this is a much larger conversation on how we are actually dealing with our own systems of governance.
You said something kind of interesting about all the silos. At university, we have silos, or we now have a committee on committees. So we have so many committees. We need a committee to manage the committees. We may not need a committee to manage the committee or whatever.
Maybe just another point I'll make on this. So I'm editing a book right now. As part of there's over 100 universities around the globe and an international collaboration looking at climate change effects in their local places. The University of Illinois is one of them. And in fact, they've been looking at parts of Chicago as part of this project. But what's been interesting is the way we've structured it is that they look at early adopters of environmental policy, late adopters, and non-adoption, and we look out to 2050. And so basically what we look at is, what's going to happen if we don't do anything? What is the cost of not doing anything? And in so many of these cases, the costs are enormous, I just edited last night the one from the University of Cairo looking at the fact that if Cairo doesn't put in place some dramatic new environmental policies, they will run out of food and water by 2050. That population will basically have nothing to support them. So I do think there's also, so the next phase of this is, so we've been talking to the UN, we're going to work on the UN sustainability goals, and the World Bank is now interested in getting this consortium of over 100 universities to do a global design project, where instead of us just looking at our local areas, what would it mean to have a global strategy that would look out to 2050 and what policies need to change. So anyway, that book will be out next year.
Make sure to bring enough copies. So this, I think this will be the final question, and then if we have time, I'll open it up to some audience questions, so get ready for those. Daniel Burnham famously stated, "Make no little plans," and to instead make big plans, aim high, and hope it work. And in the last 25 years, there's been no shortage of big plans. We've had LEAD, and then carbon neutral, net zero, the 2030 challenge, and most recently CMAP just released their On to 2050 plan. So I don't know what happened to 2030 or 2040. It feels like those problems, are they just being pushed back? Are we making progress? What exactly are we trying to achieve? And have we done so before moving on to the next plan? So I guess the question is, are we making big plans with extremely small moves? Or can we make small plans that might result in really big changes?
I'm going to take this one first.
Okay, here we go. I'm not going to use this because it's not with me. I think we need those big plans because they are setting benchmarks that are necessary, are ambitious, and are forward-looking. I more and more think that with those larger strategies, we make really tactical moves, things that are tangible, that are quick, that are dirty, that allow us to experiment, to fail, to learn that we are failing, and then try something again. And if we have one but not the other, I feel like we are missing something, right? Because it's difficult for the average citizen to understand how up in, a larger strategic framework that is looking at, 30 years from now. But it's very easy for us to see or to learn how we can start contributing and, changing our behaviors to start, dealing with very, very tangible outcomes. And it's also a way of measuring, what it is that we are achieving, what things are working or not, and I think be agile about that. And I think understanding what are the right scales of operation that are, in a way, contributing to that larger vision, but at a much smaller scale of time and space, right? Because that I think is also important. Are we talking about neighborhoods? Are we talking about districts? Or, how we talk about the space and time in a much more integrated way, and how we do it with a large and ambitious vision, very much like Abraham, but also with, the urgency of the human being that, without being a politician that is reelected every 3 years, you need to feel that things are changing, right? Otherwise, everything feels way too intangible.
So there was the Metropolis Plan of 2020, and CMAP had the Go to 2030 plan, which then went to the Onto 2040 plan. So for me, it's not a waste of time, but certainly the big plans, they sell books, they get people out to read, it's great for lectures, it's great to do all that publication, but really the hard work is really small. And it's always been really small. It's not that Chicago didn't know what to do 20 years ago or 30 years ago. The problem is somebody had to sell it so that we can all do the little pieces along the way. All the things that are happening from the Riverwalk to the housing crisis to the neighborhoods that are developing, we've always known about these things, but we have to sell it. And how do you sell it to get everyone on board, understanding the impact, in order to do the things that really matter? The really grassroots level of looking at planning and design only happens when you get people in the room, not when you sell books. No offense.
No. There's a time on the book selling side of the audience. Now we're both humiliated. I'll just add to that. Yeah, I think the era of the big global master plan, that's a land use footprint for the region, the stars haven't aligned for that. It can work in Beijing, I think we heard a while back, because the growth pressures are so great, there's wealth they never had before, taxes can be raised. In Chicago, we're a mature city, so you just don't have those resources to do that. And I think the 2050 plan and 40 plan are very creative in that sense, that they're looking at congestion pricing and municipal strategies in downtown and all kind of things where we can turn some levers to make it work. But what's happened, I think, on the global scene that's really encouraging is that both due to technology, changing tastes, new federal policy, some things have really changed. The era of 3-car garage, mini mansions on 2-acre lots, that market hasn't come back. Downtowns all around the suburbs are creating walkable neighborhoods around them. Mayor Lightfoot's thinking about congestion pricing in the loop, which can be done with digital technology with license plate readers. You have a lot of things happening among developers voluntarily, where they're creating open space and nature areas and things that are part of the amenities that millennials want. The millennials are saying, we want this, we don't want the house that I grew up in, which is, 2 air conditioners and a big backyard with a garden and all that stuff. I think the private market is interested in playing ball in ways we haven't seen before, which is really good. I mentioned developers. There's 2 privately funded high-speed rail systems around the U.S. that are getting pretty close. One of them is almost going to happen for sure. It's in Florida, the Bright Line. It's semi-high-speed, 90, 110 from Orlando to Miami. That's being built. Texas is pretty close to a breakthrough. So there's a lot of things happening that add up to a lot of big change, but it's not really being driven by these holistic plans. It's coming from lots of different pushes to get the private sector to play ball. You can just imagine if we passed a $1 tax on gasoline or a carbon tax, just how many different things would happen overnight if you you started small and did it thoughtfully, the machinery of sustainable development would happen in just 1,000 different ways.
Yeah, all great comments. And maybe I'll take us to a slightly different place, because one of the things, I know we're here to talk about cities, but I think we also have to deal with the challenges of rural America, which is being left behind by our economy. I mean, 90% of our economy is in cities, right? And so we've been starting to work with a lot of really small towns around an appreciative inquiry, asset-based set of strategies. We don't do plans. In fact, people are really suspicious of academic, intellectual elites like us coming in with a plan, right? We don't talk about plans. We come in and we are amazed at their assets. We're amazed at their natural resource assets, at the human capital assets that are under-tapped, under-recognized, underutilized. And we develop strategies with these small towns around those assets. So a town called Worthington had a lot of wind turbines, so we helped them rebuild their entire economy around wind. They now have kite flying festivals, windsurfing festivals. They have everything you can imagine, sailboat festivals, everything around wind. Wind is now this core of their new economy. Sandstone, they had great cliffs, so there turns out there's a big rock and ice climbing community in the Midwest. They built their economy around rock and ice climbing, right? And it goes on and on. And I think that strategy could also work in cities, which is that we have to stop planning, stop telling people what to do, but go to neighborhoods and understand what their assets are, really appreciate the culture that's there, the history that's there, and build from that a whole new set of strategies that can make them successful.
I want to ask more, but I promise them the chance. Are there any questions from the audience? Dr. Pesa?
I think I'm loud enough now. Okay. You touched a little bit on public-private partnerships, and I heard Maria talking about the Woodward Avenue corridor that's being developed, and correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of put a little bit of a negative spin on it because it didn't really serve the entire underserved community. And I guess my question is what do you see as the future of public-private partnership or totally private development in the public realm?
Our public member here.
Yeah.
We certainly, for instance, the local universities have seen a lot of public-private partnerships, and it's worked really well, considering the financial challenges of the state, which affected the University of Illinois over the last, say, 10 years. Having those PPPs have done some wonderful things. If you walk through the UIC campus now, you can just sort of see the changes happening as a result of that opportunity, which really wasn't, not that it wasn't around before, but it at least now they can engage in it and be able to build up the university. The work of trying to look at public-private partnerships for other things like schools, right? Schools are very straightforward. But what about the other things? Is it easy for that community center, or is it easy for even a park to have that sort of relationship? Because there's no revenue built from it, right? How do you get the revenue into those kinds of projects? So while we find the education, that's not what we mean.
Oh, yeah. Don't come at the bottom part.
No, I think it goes on
It goes in, okay, it's filtered here.
Yeah, I think it's sitting natural filter, good. So I think finding the revenue is always the hard part. And when we know that the public good, if not driven by money, is a great thing. So.
Yeah, I don't think that it's a question about PPPs yes or no. It's a yes. That's how many projects are actually happening. I think the question is a question about accountability. One, about maybe reinventing how we can maybe create opportunities. I don't think a school is, maybe a great place if it keeps being a school, but we see in other places how they are starting to, for instance, mix different uses. One that is actually a revenue generator, the other one that has more of a, community or, I don't know, non-revenue generating capacity. And then that's the way in which we can start maybe testing what are some of the ways, what are the limits of, having private interests serving, think for many cities, this is becoming, for instance, one of the only ways of engaging in the production of affordable housing. So I think the question is, what are the mechanisms that we need to create to make sure that the projects are good enough and there is, a good amount of oversight, so that, I don't know, it's that, not that I'm an expert, but that's what I see more and more. In a school, we push our students, of course, without any responsibility, to look at what are some of the boundaries. I mean, quite literally, how we can start bringing together different incomes, different uses, and, what are these kind of hybrid situations that, may give us some opportunities to think differently. But I don't teach in a business school, so I cannot tell you what it is about the design of the financial architecture that comes with, really, really challenging the public-private partnerships to do more for the public than what they are doing now. So that's only a little bit of...
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, all of us know that the pace of things can be greatly accelerated by P3s. So we can talk about a project for 20 years, or we can have a P3 and it's done fast. And I know in Chicago, we really got a black eye with the parking meters. I was the only guy in town defending it for about 2 years, and I realized that, the data was becoming more evident. Those 3 benefits I was touting were not as great as the negatives. But it's had the effect, for example, when I came to downtown, I'd bring my 12 quarters and feed the machine and go out there at lunch and put it again once a month, and the car would sit there all day. And it's had the effect of forcing the city to accelerate the way on-street parking has changed. And the first people that do these projects often get it wrong, and so everybody suffers. And now we're getting into privatization projects besides simpler things like affordable housing, where the private sector is often involved in housing, and you prompt them to go into affordable housing. Now you get to things like privatizing water systems in cities, or highways, or metro operations in the city, and it gets much more complicated. Jeff had said exactly right. But my sense is, on this point, put your hand up higher. I went off script and said you got to stop. But so I think now we're at a point where we have to start playing ball on those harder systems, lest we wait another 20 years. A good example of it is rebuilding our regional expressways. They're all near the end of their useful life, and there's no scenario for rebuilding them with existing funding without some sort of a full system. Our government's really ready to take on something that complicated all by themselves. And I think they have to play ball with private contractors. Devil's in the details. Is there risk yet? Yes, but the counter arguments would be we just think we can. So I think in the world of sustainable development, it's exciting because we can use pricing to change behavior with P3s in ways governments are unwilling to do. The private contractor, as they do with parking meter operator. I think that every problem is because of that lousy deal they forced us to take.
I mean, one reason I had to come here this morning, I was sitting last night in Minneapolis Planning and Zoning Commission, listening to them, the city, demand more from all of the development projects that were being proposed. And I know not every city can do that. I mean, shrinking cities don't have this luxury, but cities that are highly desirable to live in need to have the backbone to say it's simply not good enough. And I watched, I was listening to them getting a lot of benefit, public benefit out of these projects, one after another, because those developers knew there was a market here and they were going to succeed. And it wasn't just public open space. I mean, there's a affordable housing trade-off policy now, which, okay, you can build this huge high-rise downtown Minneapolis, but you have to build affordable housing, a certain amount, depending on the size of the project. So, I mean, there are those strategies that, cities need to have the courage to ask what they need to for the public benefit. I mean, I think there's also other interesting opportunities of sort of weird public partnerships that aren't happening. So for example, we figured out a way to build extremely affordable housing with the medical community using Medicaid dollars. And so Medicaid doesn't build housing, but they pay for patient rooms. And so we frame this as remote patient rooms with people under the care of doctors, and Medicaid will pay for that. And so there's sometimes where there's money in one bucket and a problem in another bucket, and our strategy, our creativity is about figuring out how to connect those two things. So sometimes even public-public partnerships that aren't happening now are another area of opportunity.
We have time for about one more question.
Tom, you mentioned zoning, which is a huge issue that wasn't really talked about. So with all the floodings, hurricanes, and everything, Houston was flooded. Those were all areas built in floodplain. Here in Chicago, we have all these high-rises getting built, and they're getting built beyond their floor area ratio. They're getting built larger than what they're really supposed to, with sightlines coming down. So how do we overcome that? We're architects. We're told by the client to draw this, and this is what we want this, but we need this next work. But how do we push back to the clients and say, no, we're not
That's
going
a
to do
skill
this
us
because
from
it's
your
the same.
department.
I was just, yeah. Well, so it's, I mean, we don't control policy, but we can certainly make an impact. And we do work with the Department of Planning and Zoning to push the boundaries a little bit based on that. We are public, we're not private, so our interest is the individual and not the pocketbook. So at least that gives us some leeway to do the right thing all of the time versus the opposite. The control, though, is much larger in terms of why you deal with zoning because, and I think fortunately now we have a new Commissioner of Planning straight from Detroit, so we'll see how that works. Maurice is great. All right, so a lot of it has to do with, again, that issue of change, that issue of involving the community, engaging and forgetting about the profit margin and really focusing on the individual. Looking at the walking pattern on the street and not about the skyline. So all of those things will grow. They will have to grow because we're running out of those opportunities because no one wants to change. It's hard to say, but we'll keep that.
You know, another conversation we're having in the Twin Cities is moving away from Euclidean zoning entirely to performance zoning. So the city has these goals, social justice goals, climate change goals, full employment goals, and yet you go to the next section of their comp plan, and it's all about height, setback, and it's like, wait a minute, these Euclidean ideas that have been around for 100 years have nothing to do with those goals. And so we're starting to talk about, well, what if we just say, okay, development team, you tell us how you're going to help the city achieve its, affordability goal, its environmental goal. You tell us, because the problem with Euclidean zoning is it sets the bar too low. It says, oh, you have to plant, a tree every 30 feet and some shrubs. I mean, we know that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous what's in zoning right now. And so let's engage the landscape architecture community to actually do a project that would make a big difference environmentally rather than just planting growies every 30 feet. And so, there's serious, we've got a lot of attention because we got rid of single family zoning, but we're actually thinking about chucking zoning as we know it, because cities are not going to achieve our goals given the way we're now working.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I actually haven't heard that critique that we have too much density downtown. That's an interesting point, because the bonus system does allow lots of added FAR if you do this and do that. But it's a difficult trade-off. Where I find zoning really frustrating now is we have quite a few mega projects being planned for our region, Lincoln Yards being the most notable one, where transit is really an afterthought. And it's just astounding to me that we have the next great building boom, and we're not going to link it to transit in ways that are, you look at New York, for example, with the Hudson Yards development, or Long Island City, and it's all connected to transit in ways that are pretty impressive. Here we're about to have that project. There's There's some other projects on the periphery as well. Fulton Market area that's poorly served by transit despite the new station. So all these big dense developments are happening where transit market share is probably going to be 20% instead of 50%. And that's amazing with all the innovation and all the plans to build a sustainable city that the dysfunction, it's maybe too big a word to call it dysfunction, but the political levers are strong enough they can happen. And I think in some ways things like TIF have replaced zoning as where the action is. So for developers, it used to be, oh, this parcel is in a good location, I can go bigger, I can make money. Now it's, the zoning is lower on the tier to some of these other financial techniques that can lead to some really odd outcomes. I think Lincoln Yards could be one of those. It could be fixed. We got 10 years to prepare for it. But out the box, there's some real concerns.
Yeah, I have actually a different set of concerns when I see development so profitable happening downtown. I always wonder why there is not a way of redistributing some of that extra money that is being generated here to some of the neighborhoods that need it the most. In Detroit, that has been totally impossible, and it's I think it really hurts. Because in Detroit, you can actually see what is the boundary of downtown, because you go from a really intense, high-density development to just own out the space. So for me, there is something about the experience that we are creating, and how the building is going to be touching the ground and all those kinds of things. But there is also a great opportunity, and again, I come from Europe, and I'm always looking for opportunities for some sort of connectivity. Finding ways in which downtowns can contribute more to the communities that are outside, and ways in which those communities can actually benefit. Because I don't think streets and tax incentives are benefiting anyone apart from the developments that are happening downtown, and they come at a high price for other needs that are not being developed because taxes are not being collected in some of these areas. So that is incredibly challenging, and I think it hurts the daily experience of many citizens that are not even living downtown, that are spread around the city and don't see any more benefits just because taxes are not being collected and distributed in the right way. And then just please keep testing things in between cities. We are all looking at you. I mean, this is something really interesting on how we look at other cities to see what are the innovations and what are the things that they are testing. So you know it, but just keep in mind we are looking with a lot of attention to, and not only that, I mean, it's like going from a combined sewer system to a system that is like, they did it. I mean, and now, this idea of, okay, so let's see what it is. It's not about buying, it's about, enabling things to happen. So I think there is, a lot in there that, you have capacity to experiment, because I think you have more of that culture. And we then use your experiments to try to, test what it is that we need to adapt and we need to tweak for it to be able to work in other cities.
I mean, the hope is that Chicago would pull itself back from all of the policies because it's kind of stuck itself into the box. The building code is an example of that. As soon as something happened in Chicago, the building code changed. It kept happening until it got so bad you didn't know whether you should follow the code or not. And these policies are the same, right? With all of the zoning setbacks and the issues, it seemed that now it's trying to tackle the bad apple developer, but then it affects all of us who's trying to do the better pieces. So maybe a little bit of either relaxing the policies or potentially have the staff and government to be able to listen to that good idea and say, okay, we'll circumvent that, work through the commissioner, and make it happen.
That's all the time we have. Thank you to our panelists.